kaboomy. Big kaboomy, big kaboomy. Yo guys, what is up? Max or Diablo 4 video, and today we're going over possibly the strongest build I've put together in Diablo 4. This is ShredSplosion. This build uses Bulwark explosions to deal massive amounts of damage while combining it with a Shred build to get a ton of mobility. What this build accomplishes is a variation of the Bulwark build where you're going to be dashing around from enemy to enemy, constantly exploding. This build is possible to deal Nightmare 100s. The gameplay that you saw at the beginning of the video was clearing a Nightmare 97, which had the affix that we deal 30% less physical damage. So that 72 or like 74 million explosion was with Earth and Bulwark, which deals physical damage, and we were doing 30% less. This build is absolutely crazy. I just kind of am getting things fully set up for it. So I still have glyphs that are level 15. I still don't have great gear, but what this build accomplishes is truly awesome, and I wanted to share it with you guys. So I hope you guys enjoy the full breakdown. Let's get right into it. So we're going to start with a general build overview, and then we'll get into the gear specifics, skill tree, Paragon, everything else that you need to know. So to start us off, you need this aspect for this build to function. This build does not work unless you have this aspect. Werewolf skills function as storm skills, and werebear skills function as earth skills for the Nature's Fury key passive. Now, the Nature's Fury key passive reads, casting an earth skill has a 30% chance to cast a free storm skill of the same category. So what this allows us to do is now, when we are using Shred, Shred is going to be counting as a storm skill, meaning Shred can cast earth skills. So when I shred an enemy, I can cast Landslide, for example. What that allows us to do, though, is Shred is now a storm skill, and if Shred casts Nature's Fury for an earth skill, I am going to get 8 seconds of cooldown for my earth skills. So whenever I cast Shred, I have a 30% chance to get 8 seconds of cooldown for Earth and Bulwark. And the reason we're able to do that is because we're using the symbiotic aspect. When Nature's Fury key passive triggers a free skill, your non-ultimate cooldowns of the opposite type are reduced. Note that Shred will be casting Landslides. It's not going to be casting Bulwarks, but it's going to be giving me cooldowns for Bulwarks. And that is what is so strong here. Shred is one of the fastest attacking abilities in the game. We can scale up its attack speed tremendously high, and we can make it teleport to enemies. It is going to constantly be giving us cooldown for our Bulwark, and our Bulwark is going to be giving us explosions that will deal a ton of damage. Now, how are we making Bulwark a defensive ability deal damage? Bulwark, while being a defensive ability, has a augment towards it called Innate Earth and Bulwark. Rock Shrapnel flies out when Earth and Bulwark is destroyed or expires, dealing 6,000 damage to surrounding enemies. This damage is increased by barrier bonuses. Now, this is insanely strong as soon as you start stacking barrier bonuses. Barrier bonuses are increased barrier generation. For example, on my chest piece, I've got a max roll 21% barrier generation. The more barrier generation that we get, the more damage that our Earth and Bulwark is going to do when it explodes. And you want to look for around, I would say, probably like 60% minimum barrier generation to get this build off the ground. So you're going to need barrier generation on a lot of pieces. I currently have 110% barrier generation, which is allowing for my Bulwark to hit for millions and millions of damage. Once you get those two aspects, you get your barrier bonuses and you get some Paragon points in, this build starts to take off. And the crazy thing is that the Earth and Bulwark explosion scales with enemy health. When an enemy has more health, Earth and Bulwark will deal more damage to them. Don't ask me why that is the case. It worked last season. It's still working this season. And so when you go into higher nightmares, as soon as you turn it to Nightmare 100 or Nightmare 90, 80, whatever, you'll see Bulwark actually deal more damage. So when I put it into a Nightmare 100, all of a sudden, every Bulwark was hitting at least 20 million versus when I was doing it before in like a 70, Bulwark was hitting like 6 to 7 million, upwards to like 10 million explosion. But as soon as you up the difficulty, you up your damage, which is crazy because Earthen Bulwark is a defensive ability, and it's going to allow you to push really high Nightmare dungeons with this setup. Now let's go over my gear, and I'll be breaking down stat priorities for every single slot. So to start us off, on your helmet, most important thing is barrier generation. After that is cooldown, and then max life, and either armor or basic attack speed would be really nice. I've got armor on mine. I'll talk about why basic skill attack speed is quite nice for this build, but this is a really, really good helmet, and then we're going to be using the aspect basic skills, grant us damage reduction for 3.5 seconds. I could get a better roll on this, up to 6 seconds. It's just more survivability. This build doesn't struggle with damage. We've got a skill that is going to be scaling with enemy health. We're going to be one-shotting things. We're going to look for a lot of survivability. On my chest piece, I've got armor, barrier generation, damage reduction while fortified, and damage reduction, with the most important things being barrier generation on your chest piece, your helmet, your chest piece, your totem, and your rings are where you can roll barrier generation. So those are the most important places to look for them. But damage reduction, barrier gen, all good things. And then we've got damage reduction while shapeshifted into a werewolf, which we are going to be in like 95% of the time. The only time we're not in werewolf form is when we are actually the second that we cast Bulwark, but as soon as we cast Shred, we can actually turn it into a wolf that has a Bulwark, so that is quite nice. Then we've got our gloves. We do not need a core skill here. If you could get plus Shred, that would be also really nice. I've got attack speed, lucky hit chance, crit chance, and storm skill cooldown, which is awesome. We are not actually relying on Shred to deal our damage. Once again, Shred is a vessel for our movement. It is our vehicle, and so we don't actually need more damage to it. I went for like full crit chance, lucky hit, attack speed, cooldown, with the priority here probably being attack speed and crit chance are the two most important things here. And then we've got crit chance or crit strikes with core skills, increase our attack speed. We want to be attacking as fast as possible with Shred. The more attacks per second that we can fit in with Shred, the more chances we are going to get Earthen Bulwark. And once you get your attack speed up, this build starts to really excel. Next up, on our pants, I've got damage reduction from enemies that are poisoned, armor, damage reduction while fortified, and damage reduction from distant enemies. Note, if you can stack up a ton of damage reduction while injured and go a low life Bulwark build. That'll turn your like low health, even if you only have like 4k health, you can get so much damage reduction that it basically translates to like 20k health. I personally do not have all those damage reduction while injured pieces, but the reason that's so good is because damage reduction while injured goes up so much higher than any other stat. Damage reduction while injured being while you're like below, I think it's 35% health. So I don't have those pieces right now, but just note that if you do get damage reduction while injured, it can be a massive stat for this this build. And then we've got the disobedience, gain increased armor whenever we deal damage. Super easy, more armor. We're already sitting at 7. I can get this up to 7.5k. I'm just missing a little bit more intelligence to get this up higher, but we have a ton of armor and a good chunk of life on this build already. Then I've got my boots on. This is going to give me movement speed, spirit cost reduction, movement speed, and damage reduction while injured. Spirit cost, movement speed, damage reduction while injured are the most important things. I've been playing around with my aspect on my boots. The Ghostwalker aspect I actually haven't found yet, which gives you more movement speed whenever you're unstoppable, and we're constantly unstoppable with Earthen Bulwark. Would be really nice. Right now, I've just got on when there's enemies close to us, we stun them. Just another layer of survivability. For our weapon, you're going to want to use an axe. An axe is going to have the inherent damage to healthy enemies, and we're not going to be dealing much else damage besides with our Bulwark. So enemies are going to be healthy often. It's the best implicit. We don't care about overpowered damage. And we've got a weapon with crit damage, willpower, vulnerable damage, and crit damage with earth skills. I would consider this a god roll. Only big downside is my weapon is only 764 item power, which is really low. but I've got really good stats, so I'm looking for a huge replacement upgrade. Would be really, really massive for us. And then the aspect that we're going to be using is casting a storm skill, grants your earth skills 45% increased critical strike damage for 4 seconds. Now, it's really important to note that you do need to use your basic attack on this build. We've got basic attack is going to give us damage reduction. Our basic attack is also going to give us this big crit damage multiplier for our earth skills, which you're going to get from Storm Strike. Even though Shred counts as a storm skill for Nature's Fury, it is still not a storm skill. So if you want to basic attack, you get 4 seconds where you're just going to get 45% more crit damage with our Earth and Bulwark, which is really, really nice. If you don't want to use basic attacks at all on this build, you can use an Edge Masters for your skills deal more damage while at more primary resource. That is also quite nice for this build. Then we get into our jewelry. On the amulet, you want +3 ranks of Envenom and then spirit cost and cooldown. I do not have cooldown on my amulet, which would be really nice, but I just don't have it. Ideally, the perfect amulet is ranks of Envenom, spirit cost, cooldown, and like percentage armor or another form of damage reduction. And then we're going to be using the Inexorable Force Heart, which is going to pull enemies towards us. I've been mixing and messing around with Cataclysm versus Petrify. Cataclysm, the ultimate, is going to last a very long time, and you're going to constantly pull enemies to you, which feels so good with Earth and Bulwark, because Earth and Bulwark is going to be exploding packs, and we're also going to be using the Barber Heart so that when enemies explode or they die, they trigger explosions. This will nuke entire packs for you, and Cataclysm is great at pulling all those enemies in. Next up on my ring, most important things on your ring are going to be Barrier Generation, crit chance, and vulnerable damage. In that order in terms of priority. Note that I do not have vulnerable damage on either of my rings, so I'm missing out on quite a bit of damage. And then lastly, max life would be really nice. The more life that you have, the more barrier you're going to be able to get, because barrier scales off of max life. So max life is actually a pretty important like 4th stat for this build. I just don't have vulnerable on either of these rings. Then for my aspect, I've got earth skills, deal more crit damage to crowd controlled enemies. Everything's going to be crowd controlled with this build, because everything is going to be getting hit with slows from our poison, which I'll talk about in a second. And then I've got on the heart that is going to give me damage suppression and an explosion whenever I use a defensive skill. Now, the other heart to use here is a pretty obvious choice, is the Lion Heart, which is going to give you more barrier generation and more healing. This is really nice, and I liked this. However, I found that I could tank more damage if I just put on the damage suppression heart. It's going to give us even more survivability. If you are lacking in barrier generation on your rolls, like if you don't have one on a ring or you don't have it on your chest piece, I would probably use the Lion Heart to give you that extra barrier generation. But we've got over 100%. We're doing pretty good. I didn't feel like I needed this, and so I opted for the extra damage suppression, and we get another damage explosion, which is going to hit a bunch of enemies, which also coincides with our explosions from our Bulwark, which just feels pretty good. And then lastly, I've got a ring max life barrier crit chance, and then Blood Howl is going to give us increased crit chance. It's really important for this build that our Bulwark is going to be critting. We have the crit damage from Earth skills, and we've got more crit damage from here. We are scaling a ton of crit damage. If our Bulwark is not critting, we are going to be losing a lot of damage. So at base, I'm sitting currently at, where is it? I've got 37% crit chance, which is really good. You can get that up to like 40%, which would be even better, but looking to get around like 35 to 40% in the crit chance range, and then we're going to get even more crit chance as soon as we Blood Howl, which will be up all the time. And then lastly, on our totem, I've got Lucky Hit, Spirit Cost Reduction, Barrier Gen, and Cooldown Reduction. The only thing I'd swap out here is the Lucky Hit chance for crit chance. I would prefer crit chance here. That would be a God Roll Totem, crit chance, Spirit Cost, Barrier, Cooldown. And then we've got the aspect that our Werewolf skills function as Storm skills, and Werebear skills function as Earth skills for the Nature's Fury key passive. Lastly, on your gear, you want to be using these white gems. They are going to give you increased barrier generation. Barrier generation is more damage for our Bulwark, so that's really important there. And then we're going to be using emeralds for more damage to vulnerable enemies on our weapons and our totem. Spirit Boons, we've got Wariness, 10% reduced damage from elites, pretty standard there. We're going to be using Avian Wrath for 30% more crit damage and swooping attacks for 10% more attack speed. More attack speed equals more damage with this build, because we're going to get Bulwark back faster, so more Bulwark explosions. Then we've got Bolster, Fortify for 15% of our max life when we use a defensive skill. Our Bulwark is basically on like a 2 to 3 second cooldown most of the time, and so we get basically permanent fortify just from that alone. And then we're going to be using Calm Before the Storm. Nature magic skills have a 10% chance to reduce the cooldown of our ultimate skill by 2 seconds when they lucky hit. Bulwark actually has a decent lucky hit chance. It's not great. We're boosting it up to a 37%, and it's going to be exploding all the time. We've also got Hurricane on us, which is going to give us another form of lucky hit for our nature magic skills. And yeah, those are the spirit boons. For our skill tree, we're going to be using Fierce Storm Strike with a chance to make enemies vulnerable. This is just so good, specifically if enemies run out of your exploit vulnerable window. This is just a 50% chance to make them vulnerable again. We're going to be skipping out on like Wild Impulses, which we normally would grab because we're not scaling Shred. We're going to grab more crit chance, and then Shred gives us a dash. The Primal Shred is going to give us the dash. That's a really important part. We could go for Shred giving us guaranteed poisoning on enemies for Envenom, but then we don't get the mobility of Shred, and Shred we're using exclusively for the mobility, and anytime we crit with Shred, we're going to get poison on enemies for 4 seconds anyways, and we're critting a lot with this build, so I think Primal Shred is the way to go. Then we've got Bulwark into Innate Earthen Bulwark. This is going to give us those explosions with Vigilance for more damage reduction. Blood Howl, we don't actually need the Spirit. I'll explain how we get Spirit later, but Blood Howl is going to increase our attack speed by 15% for 4 seconds, more attack speed for our Shred. Then we've got 1 point into Clarity here, gain 2 Spirit when transforming into a human form. Every time we press the Bulwark button, we're going to be getting 2 Spirit. This is quite nice quality of life here because we're going to be bulwarking all the time. Then we've got Hurricane. Now Hurricane, I had it on vulnerable there. I should be on Savage Hurricane. Enemies affected by Hurricane deal 20% less damage. This is another massive layer of survivability for us. You can actually go Cyclone Armor here instead of the Hurricane. The only reason that Cyclone Armor is actually quite nice here is because of Nature's Fury. Whenever we click Cyclone Armor, we can get a free cast of Earthen Bulwark, and whenever we cast Earthen Bulwark, we can get a free cast of Cyclone Armor, so that is quite nice, but I think the 20% enemies deal less damage just kind of outweighs Cyclone Armor a little bit there, but you do get slightly more casts of Bulwark if you do use Cyclone Armor. Then over here, Neurotoxin, our 6 out of 3 in Venom, and our Toxic Claws so that we poison enemies. Poison is going to be a slow, so anytime that we poison an enemy, they are going to get that crowd control, and when they're crowd controlled, they're going to take more damage from us. Then we've got Crushing Earth. Our skills will deal increased damage to those slowed enemies. We're going to get more damage with our skills whenever we have Fortify, which is all the time, and our crit strikes are going to fortify us. That is really nice. And then we're coming down here. We're going to be grabbing 3 out of 3 into Defiance. This is going to give us more damage with our Bulwark for elites, more damage for our damage against vulnerable enemies, and whenever we use our Storm Strike, or we use Cataclysm, or we use Hurricane, our next cast of Bulwark is going to get 6x damage, triple that if we actually like set it up right. So that's really, really good. And then we're going to be using Cataclysm for most scenarios. For high Nightmare dungeons, I like Petrify, and for bossing, Petrify is better. But for like most content, Cataclysm is just really nice quality of life. But once again, Petrify is going to give you that big crit damage multiplier and also stun enemies. So high Nightmares, use Petrify. For just about everything else, use Cataclysm. And then we're going 1 point into Quick Shift. Whenever we shapeshift into a different form, it gives us increased damage. That's not really important here. What is important is the heightened senses. Upon shapeshifting into a werewolf or werebear form, gain 12% damage reduction against elites for 5 seconds. We're constantly going in and out of werewolf form and back to human form. So that is really nice there. And then we are going to be using the Nature's Fury as our key passive. This is what glues this whole build together. You can find my full Paragon board at dpscheck.gg. My Paragon board is really good and what I would spec, but it is missing a few things, mainly in glyph levels for glyphs that would be quite nice for this build. For example, the Protector glyph is specific for barrier builds, giving us increased damage reduction while we have a barrier and bonus to our rare nodes. This is level 1 right now, so obviously I'm not using it in my board, but it could be quite nice. The way I've set up my board is to grab a ton of armor, a ton of damage, and a ton of quality of life. So to start us off in our board, we've got the Exploit glyph, where it's going to give us free vulnerable and more damage to vulnerable enemies. Then we move up to the Earth and Devastation board for more crit damage, more damage with our Earth skills. Then we've got more crit damage with our Earth skills here, grabbing more armor, and then we're going up into the Thunderstruck board to give us the Shapeshifter glyph. This is going to give us a 20% chance to cause these skills damage to critically strike. When we shapeshift, we're going to be shapeshifting from werewolf form to human form for the Shapeshifter glyph for our Earthen Bulwark, and back and forth constantly. So this is really, really nice crit chance for us. And then more crit damage with Deluge there. And then we're going across to the Inner Beast board. Now we are grabbing the Inner Beast Legendary node and kind of like doing a lot in this board. Inner Beast is going to give us a ton of spirit cost reduction. We are using Shred, and the only ways of getting our spirit cost down are Inner Beast, and we're also grabbing Ancestral Guidance board for spirit on kill. This is what allows us to shred constantly and not run out of spirit, so I can't recommend this enough. We're going up high to get max life and armor. We've got the spirit glyph here for more crit damage, which is really, really nice. More attack speed, which is also great. More armor. Ancestral Guidance for that after we spend 75 spirit, we deal 30% increased damage. And then we're moving over to the Heightened Malice board. Heightened Malice is going to give us damage reduction from poisoned enemies, damage to poisoned enemies. And this is where I've got the Territorial Glyph for damage to close enemies and damage reduction against close enemies. You could also swap this out for the Werewolf Glyph, which I'm still leveling for damage reduction while in werewolf form and increased damage while you are in werewolf form. I originally didn't think that would work, but then I saw that we are actually quite often a wolf when Bulwark is going off. So that would be really nice. But yeah, that is my Paragon board. I've still got some glyphs to level, and you will see any updates that I make to the build. I'm obviously not level 100, so I've still got points to spend. Any updates to the Paragon board on dpscheck.gg. But this board that I have it set up is giving us a lot of armor nodes, a lot of health nodes, a lot of quality of life, and a lot of damage. Guys, that is going to do it for the build video. I hope you enjoyed. This build is a ton of fun. I know one of the questions I'm going to get asked is, why aren't you using a Crone Staff on this build? The reason I'm not using a Crone Staff is because as soon as we put on the Crone Staff, then we're going to have to use basic attacks to get our Nature's Fury back. And at that point, I don't even know why you would use Shred in the first place. The Bulwark build and playstyle is something that came out last season. I'm not the first person to do it. I didn't reinvent the wheel here, but I did think that the Bulwark playstyle was a little dull, and so I wanted to throw some spice into it by adding Shred and allowing us to teleport to enemies, give us faster dungeon clears by using Shred as a vehicle for transportation, which means that we don't use the Crone Staff. We get more aspects here. We get more cooldown. We get more crit chance from this, which I don't have crit chance right now, but it's a really, really neat way to play the Bulwark build. And in the patch that's coming out, they're buffing boss life by like 50 to 80% on the high end, and this build scales its damage off of enemies' health, so this build is going to get even stronger when bosses get buffed, which is really, really crazy. So yeah, I will have more updates to this build as I play it more and I level those glyphs, but I just wanted to show you guys what I'm using because it's so much fun and it does these crazy nuke explosions to bosses and to packs. Guys, this is going to do it for the video. I hope you enjoyed. I will catch y'all on the next one. Take care, guys. Peace!